And it was, in fact, in this city, in Tlaxcala, that Cortés found the military allies, the thousands of soldiers who actually enabled his conquest of Tenochtitlan and the Aztec Empire, a pivotal turning point in world history that we're always taught to think about as the great triumph of European technology, guns, germs, and steel, as a book put it, forgetting that it was also, in fact, at least partly the result of collective deliberations in an indigenous urban parliament. And actually, archaeologists have worked on the site of Tlaxcala to excavate down below into the earlier levels, going back to the pre-conquest times, back to, say, the 14th century. And what they find there is really astonishing. It's like a typical Mesoamerican city in reverse. Again, the most important buildings are not palaces or temples. They're actually the housing of the ordinary citizens raised up on these rather handsome terraces with a very large area for communal assemblies. But it's not just our understanding of cities that archaeology and anthropology have been turning on its head. We also know now that the history of human societies before the coming of cities and even before the coming of farming and agriculture is simply nothing like what we used to imagine. Far from living most of their lives in tiny bands of hunter-gatherers roaming around the landscape, we now have evidence for a really incredible variety of social and political experimentation before the appearance of agriculture. To give just a flavor of this diversity, let me mention a few examples brought to light by archaeological research in recent decades. In sub-Saharan Africa, for example, prehistorians can show now that 50,000 years ago, hunter-gatherer societies were already forming enormous networks of social and cultural exchange, covering large parts of the continent. In Europe, during the last ice age, so going back about 25,000 years, we find evidence all the way across the continent, from Russia to the Mediterranean, for the burial of certain individuals in a way which looks almost like the burial of a king or a queen. We're talking about people who were placed into the ground, into their graves, absolutely covered with rich ornamentation and elaborate weaponry, and even things that look like royal symbols or regalia. Archaeologists like to give these burials names. They call them princes and princesses, without always stopping to ask where their kingdoms actually are, because all we see are the burials. And I'll come back to this point in a moment. In Central Europe and Eastern Europe, which during the last ice age were covered by steppe and tundra, we also find the remains of huge public buildings constructed from the bones and the tusks of woolly mammoth, standing out clearly from ordinary dwellings. Even more striking, in the Middle East, you may have seen a site that's become very famous in the south of Turkey, the site of Göbekli Tepe, with huge stone monuments, great stone temple-like buildings dating back to around 11,000 years ago, centuries before the domestication of wheat and barley. In Japan, we know that the storehouses of Sanai Maruyama could already hold massive surpluses of wild plant foods long before the arrival of rice farming from the Korean peninsula. And before the coming of maize cultivation to North America, indigenous peoples were already constructing massive earthworks like those of a site called Poverty Point in modern-day Louisiana. Here they created amphitheaters that could have held hunter-gatherer publics in their thousands. Take off the blinkers, and you can see before you these days evidence for a pre-agricultural world that is simply nothing like what we used to imagine. It's not a world of roving hunter-gatherer bands, although those probably existed too. It's also a world of sedentary towns and villages, monumental sanctuaries, and stockpiled wealth. Quite often, it seems, hunter-gatherer societies actually alternated quite routinely between different political structures, often with the changing requirements of the seasons, times of great abundance or times of scarcity. And this is very important for a variety of reasons, because it shows us that early human populations would already have been conscious of multiple social possibilities, multiple ways of arranging their affairs.